So I have the great pleasure of introducing tonight's special guest speaker. Certainly to Americans, he will be a very known person. Jonah Goldberg holds the Asness Chair in Applied Liberty at the American Enterprise Institute and is a fellow at the National Review Institute. He was previously senior editor at National Review, where he worked for 20 years. He's a best-selling author. His nationally syndicated column appears regularly in over 100 papers across the United States. He's a weekly columnist for the Los Angeles Times, a member of the board of contributors to USA Today, a Fox News contributor. He's also the founding editor of National Review Online. He's been identified by The Atlantic magazine as one of the top 50 political commentators in the United States. He's won numerous awards. In 2011, for example, he was named the Robert J. Novak Journalist of the Year at the Conservative Political Action Conference, otherwise known as CPAC. He's written on politics, media, and culture for a variety of leading publications and has appeared on numerous television and radio programs. His most recent book is Suicide of the West. We do have some copies here. I have to say that at least half of them have already been sold, so if you're interested in buying copies, don't go now. Go after the lecture. Be sure of what you're buying. So it's our great pleasure to have tonight with us Jonah Goldberg. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the overly generous introduction. If you like this jacket, I bought it in Grand Rapids today because I forgot to bring my own. And although apparently that means now that I have a trade deficit with Grand Rapids, which is apparently a terrible thing. You know, you take my money and all I get is a jacket. So I didn't internalize the incredibly international / ecumenical nature of this conference, and so I apologize if there's some things that make more sense to an American audience, but as a conservative, albeit one who's stressed at times these days, normally after I get an introduction like that, I always point out that one of the highlights of my career was something that wasn't mentioned, and it was that when the Los Angeles Times picked me up as a columnist, Barbra Streisand canceled her subscription in protest. And I'm sorry if you're from Spain or Nigeria and you're like, what? But so be it. We're going to do a Q&A and all of that, and so I'm going to do a much more abbreviated version of this talk so we can get to the questions. So as Henry VIII said to each of his wives, I won't keep you long. Yeah, so if you don't know, again, I'm one of these after dinner speakers on the right who's like supposed to be thoughtful but also kind of amusing, and it's a hard act to pull off. It kind of makes me feel like the guy who's wants to be both a veterinarian and a taxidermist, because that way you can promise you'll get your dog back no matter what. So. And I'm supposed to talk about my book, Suicide of the West, soon to be released in paperback, and maybe with a new title, maybe something just like Buy Gold. But that way we could sell a lot more copies on Fox News. But no, in all seriousness, it's an interesting thing that I wrote a book in 2018 called Suicide of the West. And the chief criticism from a lot of the new self-described nationalist or post-liberal right in America was that it was way too optimistic. And I'm not kidding. I mean, that was the central indictment. It was that, you know, Suicide of the West was just too cheery. I used to joke that the original working title was Why You Should Take a Bath with a Toaster, but it does tell you something about the state of conservatism and the state of despair on many parts of the right these days, and which is a strange thing. And also, Father Sirico can correct me, I do believe that despair is a sin, so you shouldn't do it. So anyway, I'm a little nervous about this, given that it's Acton and the Father's in the front row and all the rest, but the first words of my book are, there is no God in this book. Now, I want to be clear about that up front so I can explain why I say it. It's not because I'm an atheist. I'm not an atheist. It is because I'm trying to do something that a lot of people on the right don't seem interested in doing anymore, which is persuading people who disagree with me. That's what politics is supposed to be about. Go back to Aristotle. It's about convincing people who are in one coalition that their interests are better served by being in your coalition than the one that they're currently in. Instead, we live in a time where so much, and thank God the Acton Institute stands athwart all of this, but there's an enormous amount of infotainment going on the right these days that is aimed almost entirely to trigger dopamine hits in your brain and talk about how delicious liberal tears are rather than make anything like a real argument. And so I wanted to get to persuasion. And so the reason I say there's no God in this book is that I'm not making an appeal to the authority of God to say why we have what we have or why these things happened. I'm working on the terms of progressives or secularists or modernists, whatever you want to call them, who say they care about science, they care about data, they care about materialistic explanations for things. And so I wanted to make the case for what I believe on their terms rather than on my terms. And so that's why I say at the beginning of the book, there is no God in this book. And the book begins 250,000 years ago, where I sort of assert, there's debate about it, that's when Homo sapiens split off from the Neanderthals. Now that's the polite way to say it. What that really means is that's when we killed all the Neanderthals. And frankly, I think they kind of had it coming, but that's a different debate. And so I borrow a thought experiment from a psychologist at Yale, and I asked the reader to imagine that they are an alien from another planet, and their job is to monitor the progress of Homo sapiens over the last 250,000 years. Now there's a trick, or a hitch. You can only come once every 10,000 years. So in your first visit, what would you show up in the atmosphere, you take out your notebook and you start looking down, what would you write? Well, you write in your little journal, semi-hairless apes foraging and fighting for food. Come back in 10,000 years, you'd write, semi-hairless apes foraging and fighting for food, no change. Come back in 10,000 years, semi-hairless apes foraging and fighting for food, no change. Now there'd be some changes, migration would move, so diet would move and all the rest, but really nothing significant would happen until your 24th visit. And on your 24th visit, you would see some amazing things. You would see the emergence of agriculture, which led to the emergence of the first city-states. You would see metallurgy and some really fetching clay pottery. And you'd be like, wow, this is amazing. All this happened in just 10,000 years. I can't wait for my next visit. So you come back for your 25th visit, and you would get here, and as your ship pulled up to planet Earth, NORAD would pick you up on their radar, and you might get here just in time to see Miley Cyrus twerking at the Super Bowl. Which is to say that virtually everything that we associate with human progress has happened in the last 10,000 years. But that is misleading. It's like me saying the combined net worth of me and Jeff Bezos is over $100 billion. It's true, it's just leaving some details out, right? And so that's because really almost all of the stuff that we consider to be progress, material progress, the stuff that the left in particular says is what they care about politics for, is the improvement of man's condition, of education, of literacy, all of these things. almost all of the real progress has happened in the last 300 years. For 7,500 generations, for as far back as you want to go, because we have ancestors that go back before the Homo sapiens, the average human being everywhere in the world, lived on no more than $3 a day. For 250,000 years, it's like this. And then it starts to go like this, once and only once in all of human history. That's a much more interesting hockey stick graph than like carbon emissions since the Industrial Revolution, but that's a different argument. As the economic historian Todd Buchholz once said, for most of man's life on Earth, he lived no better on 2 legs than he had on 4. The average Roman legionnaire, in terms of material circumstances, lived no better than the average Englishman in 1600. The amount of time it took you to travel hadn't changed in Europe for thousands of years. And then all of a sudden there's just this explosion. Now, I call this the miracle. I don't call it a miracle because God created it, though I'm totally open to that argument. I say it's a miracle precisely because we actually don't know why it happened. And what I mean by that is there is an overwhelming consensus on the left and the right among Marxist historians and non-Marxist historians and free market historians about that hockey stick thing, about the $3 a day thing. Some people say it was $5, whatever, but basically for almost all of human history, every now and then someplace gets a little rich and then the logic of Malthusianism or something else kicks in and you get regression back to the mean. Everybody basically agrees on that poverty is natural, that man's natural condition is a life of grinding poverty punctuated by an early death, usually from violence or some bowel stewing disease. There's consensus about that. There's not consensus about why it stopped and why it started to go like this. There's a lot of different arguments about it. I call it a miracle because we're not going to settle those arguments, but instead we should be just simply grateful that it happened. My own argument about why it happened is that there's this thing that I call the Lockean Revolution. I'm not saying that John Locke created it. He contributed to it. He was important to it. But I could have called it the Smithian Revolution. I could have called it a lot of different things. He's a symbol of this change in attitudes. This change in the story that some people in a specific place started telling themselves about themselves. It was this idea that says our rights come from God, not from government. We are citizens, not subjects. Therefore, the individual is sovereign. And therefore, the fruits of our labors belong to us. That innovation is good. For most of human history, innovation was considered a grave threat by the powers that be. And so you had all sorts of civilizations were way ahead of Western Europe. Western Europe was a backwater for an enormous amount of time. Chinese had almost all the great technology before the West did, the Arabs. You can find all of these things, but what would happen is it would be seen as a threat to the established order, and it would get crushed. In Western Europe, innovation was in fact a sin. It was the sin of curiositas, or however you pronounce it, which is questioning the established order. And then this weird bourgeois revolution takes place, where all of a sudden innovation is seen as a good thing, and that the fruits of your labors belong to you, and that the government works for you, you don't work for it. And all of a sudden, wealth starts going like this. And so part of the takeaway of this is that what did it was just words, ideas, rhetoric. The way we talk about ourselves changed and unleashed all of this. Another takeaway from this, which I can't get too deep in the weeds on given the time, but is that this suggests that a lot of the things that, including a lot of my friends on the right, like to say are natural, are in fact not natural. Democracy is not natural. Property rights are not natural. You can deduce some of these things from a notion of what natural rights are, but even the notion of natural rights, if it were truly part of human nature, would have showed up a little earlier in the evolutionary record. Right? If you take a jar of ants and you dump it off on an island that has, no ants on it, or on a planet or whatever, you dump out the ants will start digging tunnels and anointing a queen, or whatever ants do. I'm not an expert on ants, but they'll do ant stuff. If you take human beings shorn of their civilizational programming and you put them on an island someplace, they won't all of a sudden start creating iPhone apps that help you order weed delivered to your house. They'll start acting like semi-hairless apes, foraging and fighting for food. And so this gets to the central point of my book, which is that, corruption, today we talk about corruption, and the word sort of means graft or bribery, and it's how we basically describe how things work in Chicago, right? And that's fine, that's a kind of corruption. But corruption has a much deeper, poetic, metaphysical meaning. It's certainly in the history of the Catholic Church, but also just in the English language and around the world. It's caught up in ideas about like entropy, the second law of thermodynamics, the idea of ashes to ashes and dust to dust. This idea that nature will always reclaim what is hers. As the Roman poet Horace said, you can chase nature out with a pitchfork, but it will always come rushing back in. Rust doesn't sleep. Termites don't care whether they're eating an outhouse or a grandfather clock. Nature takes what it wants. And this also applies to human nature. When you don't hold human nature at bay, when you don't channel it towards productive ends through institutions that have an understanding of where the seams in human nature are, we fall back on our default programming. This is one of the central insights of conservatism, is this idea that human nature has no history. That we are all, as Hannah Arendt used to say, every generation Western civilization is invaded by barbarians. We call them children. And anybody who's had kids understands what I'm talking about. Kids do not come into the world as tabula rasas. They come in with a whole bunch of factory preset software. And they need updates. And the updates come from these things called families and communities and churches and synagogues. These are the things that a civilization does. Because every generation we start off as barbarians. If you take a baby from, I don't know, we're in Michigan, from Ann Arbor, and you send it back 1,000 years to a Viking village, it will grow up to rape and pillage the English countryside, if it gets adopted. If you take a Viking baby and you send it to Ann Arbor, it's going to grow up to own a hemp sweater store. Because again, we get who we are from the civilization that we're born into. And so the argument I am making is that this amazing thing, like this miracle, whatever reason you want to think it happened, the inarguable fact is that it happened only once. And by my lights, in one place. Now, I argue that it starts in England for reasons we can talk about in the Q&A. There are serious people who I admire and respect a great deal who say it started in Holland. If there are any Dutch jingoists in the room, we can have that argument. But what you can't argue about is that it started once and in one place. And it's still going on today. We live in the greatest moment of poverty alleviation in all of human history. And we don't teach people about it. We don't celebrate it. We bemoan it. Yeah, globalization is causing problems in America and a lot of the industrialized world. It's also pulling hundreds of billions of people out of crushing poverty. The UN's not doing that. These ideas are what's doing it. And you get... And so what happens is, we live in a moment where, so part of my argument is that the Romantic era never really ended. The stuff we call Romanticism ended in, I don't know, 1840, whatever, I don't know. But the essence of what Romanticism was, it used to be that nationalism was actually described as, the term for it was Romantic nationalism. It emerges as a rebellion essentially against the imposition of French Enlightenment thinking on Germany. It emerges as a rebellion against the steel cage of the mechanical thinking of the Enlightenment. At least that's how it presented itself. And it put the primacy of emotions above everything else, of feelings above everything else. The highest source of authenticity was personal authenticity. We live in an age that teaches, that drenches children in this. And it's amazing, like, the very essence of good parenting is the opposite of saying things like, go with your instincts. Right? Go with your gut. Hey, I wouldn't run with scissors, but hey, you be you. Right? But that's what we teach people, is we teach people this romantic notion that the inner light of their own emotional states is the most important thing in the world. That is a form of corruption. We are falling back to say that human nature that has not been formed by reason, that has not been informed by notions of traditional morality, but that just sheer personal feelings are supreme. And that's incredibly dangerous. We've known for thousands of years, particularly with men, because men are barbarians more than women are, that if not properly civilized, we fall back on these patterns that are part of our human nature. Nature comes rushing back in. That's the story of Lord of the Flies, right? These pinnacles of Western civilization, these snot-nosed British boarding school kids, they're dropped off on an island for 5 minutes without adult supervision, and all of a sudden they're running around with spears and war paint, and they're worshiping, a demon god. That's what humans do when we turn our backs on civilization. And that's what we're teaching people to do, is we're teaching people to go with their guts and go with their instincts and turn back to things that feel more natural. This is the great problem with liberal democratic capitalism. It is the most cooperative system ever created, and it's the only system ever created to actually alleviate poverty. But it's the most cooperative system ever created to organize human affairs. The problem is it doesn't feel like it. It's so good, it's invisible. It's like those old Ivory soap ads, 99 and 44% pure. You don't even feel it. It's just, like fish don't know they're wet. We don't know how much we're cooperating with each other. I'm hoping at some point in your Acton experience, someone has told you about I Pencil, this essay by Leonard Read. It's one of the greatest essays in the history of libertarianism. It's written from the perspective of the pencil. The pencil begins saying, I am an Eberhard and Faber #2 pencil. And it goes on to explain, first of all, no one knows how to make a pencil. No one. Pencil manufacturers know how to put together the last 2% of ingredients. The pencil goes on to point out, my wood comes from Canada, my rubber comes from Indonesia, my paint comes from Delaware, my zinc comes from Zincland. I don't know where zinc comes from. And all of these people, a lot of people in this room, from different cultures, different languages, different faiths, are working seamlessly together to produce something from all around the world that ends up costing like less than a penny. He was writing in the 1950s. Imagine, if you tried to organize socialism to make a pencil. There was a guy a few years ago, 10 years ago, there was an exhibit at the British Museum called iToaster, where a guy made a toaster from scratch. And I mean from scratch. He dug up, he mined the copper, he galvanized the rubber, he did the stuff to the tin that one does when one makes a toaster. It took him a couple years, and it was a really crappy toaster. There was another guy who did it, who made a chicken sandwich from scratch. And I don't mean like going to the farmer's market and getting like the ingredients. There's a chicken and an egg joke in here somewhere, but he got a chicken, the chicken made an egg. So he could make the mayo, then he killed the chicken to make the chicken meat. He grew the wheat for the bread. He did all this kind of stuff. It cost him $1,500. And at the end, you can find it on YouTube. And at the end of it, he was like, it's an okay sandwich. That's one of the miraculous things about the division of labor, is it lets people work together. It's the pin factory from the Wealth of Nations. But it doesn't feel like it. And so when we don't have institutions like the family and organized religion that civilize the barbarians, we start falling back on human nature. And we are brought into this world to be tribal. Identity politics is one form of tribalism. Nationalism is one form of tribalism. Socialism is one form of tribalism. My first book was about fascism, and I always used to say that all of these different totalitarianisms were all different forms of tribalism. Nazism was tribalism for one race. Fascism was tribalism for one nationality. Communism was tribalism for one class. Workers of the world unite. These are old ways of thinking, but they're wired into us that have to be untaught. It's like when we say you have to teach people to hate. That's nonsense. You have to be too stupid to be a spell checker at an M&M factory to believe that. We know from experiments, there's an amazing book called Just Babies by Paul Bloom at Yale, psychologist at Yale, called Just Babies, where he runs through all the literature about the experiments they do with babies and kids up to about 3 or 2.5. No babies were harmed in the conducting of these experiments. And they come in with this innate moral sense. They come in with these notions of right and wrong. They come in with all these sorts of things. But they also come into this world with fear of people who look different than them. French babies are born into this world crying with French accents. I'm not making that up. Russian babies have Russian accents because the babies in utero hear these sounds and they pick up little tonal differences. And they also bond with the phenotype of their parents, whoever they first meet, because they think, okay, this is what normal looks like, and then they see someone who looks different, and they think that's abnormal, and that's scary, because babies are incredibly vulnerable things. And one of the great things about liberal democratic capitalism is it teaches people how to deal with strangers in a non-zero-sum way. In a state of nature, if you have a barrel of apples and I want, well, you don't have a barrel. If you have a bushel of apples and I want your apples, the way I get them is I hit you over the head with a rock and I take your apples. In the world of the market, I give you money. You like money. You give me apples or a jacket in Grand Rapids. And it's win-win. It's non-zero sum. And that is one of the great and glorious things about the market and the extended order of liberty, or what Friedrich Hayek would call the macrocosm compared to the microcosm. And one of the points he makes, and I know I got to wrap this up, so I will in a second, but Friedrich Hayek points out that the rules of the microcosm, which is his word for what Edmund Burke would call the little platoons, or what you would just call the world of friends, family, faith, local community, are completely different than the rules of the extended order of liberty. You know, my wife always gets mad at me when I drop in phrases like Gesellschaft and Gemeinschaft, but the extended order of liberty is contractual, it's market-based, it's law-based. The world of the personal, of friends and family, is intimate and personal. I always try to tell people, when I talk to college students, I always say, look, in my family, I am a communist. And I mean it quite literally. Like, I do not charge my daughter for food. I don't charge her for her clothes. I don't charge her rent yet. If you have 2 sons, and one's a complete lunkhead, and the other one is like a straight A student and a great guy, you don't give the lunkhead worse food. Right? Because within your family, it is literally from each according to his ability to each according to his need. But in the extended order, you do charge people for food if they come into your house and they take your food. You do have different rules. And what Hayek points out is when you try to take the logic of the microcosm of the family and you try to apply it to the extended order, to the nation state, you destroy liberty. Because you are taking these ancient sort of tribal understandings of right and wrong and you're crushing them on top of the market and on democracy. But also, if you take the rules of the market and democracy and you apply them to the family, you'll destroy the family. And so what is required is a healthy tension between both. And one of the reasons why we have our problems today is we don't understand where these lines are, and the institutions that are supposed to civilize us are falling down on the job. So I just want to close. Obviously, you can tell I didn't actually read from anything tonight, but Francis Fukuyama got a lot of grief for saying we were at the end of history. He wasn't saying history was over. He wasn't saying important things weren't going to happen. He was saying that an argument was settled about the best way to organize a society in a Hegelian sense. We had reached the end of history because liberal democratic capitalism was the best. He was right. And it calls to mind one of my favorite speeches of all time by Calvin Coolidge, praise be upon him, who in his 150th anniversary of the Gettysburg, the Declaration of Independence, he says, about the Declaration, there is a finality that is exceedingly restful. It is often asserted that the world has made a great deal of progress since 1776, that we've had new thoughts and new experiences which have given us a great advance over the people of that day, and that we may therefore very well discard their conclusions for something more modern. But that reasoning cannot be applied to this great charter. If all men are created equal, that is final. If they are endowed with inalienable rights, that is final. If governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed, that is final. No advance, no progress can be made beyond these propositions. If anyone wishes to deny their truth or their soundness, the only direction in which he can proceed historically is not forward, but backward. Backward towards the time when there was no equality of rights, no rights of the individual, no rule of the people. Those who wish to proceed in that direction cannot lay claim to progress. They are reactionary. Their ideas are not more modern, but more ancient than those of the revolutionary fathers. Look around. Look, we have all these debates right now about going left towards socialism or right towards nationalism. But the fact is, we're at the mountaintop already. Doesn't mean we don't have problems to solve and all of the rest. We have arguments about this program or that program. But on these basic questions about how to organize human affairs, this is as good as it gets. And when you're at the top of the mountain, you can argue about going left towards socialism or right towards nationalism. It doesn't matter, because when you're on the top of the mountain, whichever direction you're talking about going, the real direction you're talking about is down, back to where we came from. And so I end the book calling for people to have a sense of gratitude for how good we have it compared to the norm of humanity. And I can't talk about that here, but maybe it'll come up in the Q&A, but I want to say how grateful I am to be able to talk to you guys tonight. Thank you all very much.
Well, thank you, Jonah. That was very interesting. That's not quite what I meant. Yeah.
She has a great personality.
Yeah. Be careful. Okay, we have a number of people who are posing questions on Slido. The thing I do like about this system is that we don't have people asking you to comment on their doctoral dissertation or other interesting things.
I'm sure they'll bring that up to me in the hall afterwards.
I'm sure they will. But we do have a number of questions about the state.
Uh-huh.
So we have a number of people saying, your book talks, for example, about human responsibility, and it has a conception of the good life. Where does the state fit into this? And there are other questions concerning things like, what's the role of the state in a contemporary, modern, liberal, capitalist democracy as you're describing it?
Sure. I'm not a huge fan of the state. I like government. I like governments with enumerated powers as laid out in the liner notes of the Federalist Papers and the Constitution and whatnot. Part of my problem with the state is that it's in some ways it's a European concept that has been imposed on American thinking, largely because of the progressives through Woodrow Wilson, the worst president in American history. And so I have grown, at the federal level, I've grown much more libertarian over the years. At the federal level, my view of what I really want the state, the government, to do what the Constitution says it should do and nothing else. So yeah, an army, I guess Judge Bork tells me that paper money is unconstitutional, or told me, but I think that ship has sailed. Although Facebook may, do something on that. Post offices in the Constitution, there are a few other things. Environmental protections, promoting the general welfare, there is some of that you can make a defense for. But I get much more communitarian as you get down to the local level. And I think one of the reasons why we have such an uprising of populism on the left and the right these days is because everybody is looking to this government in Washington as if it's the solution to all of our problems, rather than looking in their own backyards where you actually have to deal with people who have names and who know how to fire. There's an argument going around on the right these days that we need the state to now impose morality in the way that we've been accusing the left of trying to use the state to impose morality for a very long time. I unabashedly disagree with it. I think it is dangerous and dumb. And I use the word dumb seriously. It is so ill-advised because the liberal democratic order that we have enshrined in the Bill of Rights and in the Constitution is designed to protect religious minorities and the idea, among other people, and the idea that if we can just get our people in the state to impose some sort of Aristotelian notion of the highest good, that'll be awesome. It sort of reminds me of the old thing, it's like my ancestors on the shtetl used to say the best form of government is the good czar. The problem is the worst form of government is the bad czar. And if you don't set up a system that figures out how you only have good czars, it's better just not to have czars at all. So,
thanks. We have a number of questions about populism, something you touched upon in your remarks. We have one question, for example, says, given the worldwide growth of populism, how should we respond to legitimate concerns of populists?
Sure. I was going to make a joke about tear gas, but I actually don't believe that. There are absolutely legitimate concerns of populists. Populism, at the end of the day, part of my problem with all the talk about how great populism is that populism is just simply another word for anger and strength. It's a word used to sort of talk about people who are very angry, who are making demands in almost mob-like fashion, and that doesn't mean they don't have legitimate complaints, but there's no limiting principle to populism. There's no philosophical guiding spirit to populism. And the logic of populism tends to spread like a cancer cell insofar as that populists love to talk about we the people, but they invariably only mean a fraction of the people, a segment of the people. And the American political tradition, what we are supposed to do is have a responsive legislative branch, particularly the House, that takes in populist sentiment, translates it into legislation, and then the grown-ups in the Senate sort of tinker with it a little bit, and then we get laws. My view towards populism is very much like my view towards nationalism. A little of it is a healthy thing, right? It's sort of like with nationalism, the analogy I always use is like, it's like salt. If anybody here cooks, you know that salt is essential to making the meal come together. A pinch of salt brings out the flavors, it unites the whole dish. Too much salt kind of ruins the dish. Way too much salt is literally toxic. And the same thing goes for things like populism and nationalism. Part of my problem with populism as well is that it's inherently anti-intellectual. William Jennings Bryan has this great line where he says, the people of Nebraska are for free silver, therefore I am for free silver, I will look up the arguments later. I like arguments. Democracy is about disagreement, not about agreement. And if you like pure democracy, you essentially like populism, because in a pure democracy, 51% of the people get to pee in the cornflakes of 49% of the people. I am not a pure majoritarian in any sense, whatever label we want to put on it.
We have a number of Locke scholars in the audience, apparently. In fact, I know one who's in the audience. And the question is being asked, Whittaker Chambers said, without God, man cannot organize the world for man. Without God, man can only organize the world against man. Locke agreed. What do you think?
I think, so as I say later in the book, one of the main drivers of the crisis of the West is the loss of God-fearingness. Because, there's that sort of Hallmark card notion that good character is what you do when nobody else is watching. When you believe God was watching you and you thought you might get him angry, it was a useful check on certain kinds of behaviors. But because we live in this sort of Rousseauian romantic notion that says we look inward to our own personal truths and we try to celebrate our own emotional states as the highest good, so many of our heroes these days are Byronic heroes. They're mavericks who play by their own rules. And so long as they stay true to their own code, they're okay. And I can list dozens of characters in popular culture who are like serial killers, but they're consistent about who they kill. And that's supposed to be like some great badge of honor. So I think, I agree with Whittaker Chambers that, and with Locke, if that's the characterization that we're going with Locke, that God is a hugely important civilizational guardrail, and that religion in particular as well is a hugely important civilizational guardrail. I am not well versed enough to explain to people why they should believe in God if they don't. But I am willing to say that the fact that so many people stopped believing in God was a net bad thing for a lot of people.
Here's a related question, and it also ties into some of the things you said about localism. Mm-hmm. How do we retrieve a culture of collaboration and community-sponsored self-reliance? And the next question right next to that is the Benedict option the way?
I'm very sympathetic to the Benedict option, and I wish some of my friends on the post-liberal, integralist, Catholic right would try to take over Rhode Island first. There was a movement a few years ago among libertarians to encourage libertarians from all over the country to move to New Hampshire, right? Set reasonable goals. And I'm a sincere believer that, and whether you want to call it subsidiarity or federalism or localism, doesn't really matter to me. It's the best system ever conceived of for maximizing human happiness because it lets the most people live the way they want to live. And when I talk to college students about this, I do a whole greaseboard thing about imagine if you had 10 dorms and you were trying to figure out what the rules about social life in the dorms would be. You could do it the dictatorship model, which would be dictatorial. The president of the school imposes one rule in all 10 dorms. Or you could do it democratically, where 51% get to vote on how 49% of the people should live. And you could do it a whole bunch of different ways. But if you let each dorm decide what the rules are that they want to live under, just mathematically, more people will live the way they want to live, and the people who lose those votes can move to a different dorm. And the same thing holds true for communities. If you don't want to have big knockdown, drag-out fights that you keep losing with your neighbors, move to some place where people agree with you more. But you'll still have culture war fights. You'll still have, bitter disagreements. But the winners have to look the losers in the eye the next day. You see them at the grocery store. You see them when you're dropping off your kids for soccer. And that imposes a certain amount of humility. It also puts names and faces on people so they're no longer these unseen, faraway globalists or Jews or whatever who are running our lives. It's Ted and Sarah and Phil. You know who to fire. And that's hugely important. I think it's empowering. And so the Benedict option, if people want to resign from, I think everybody would be better off. The nation would be better off, and the individual communities would be better off if we had more communities that organized around shared beliefs. And also, and this is a point that works pretty well with college students, it would make this a hell of a lot more interesting country to drive across. We would have, I'm sick of this definition of diversity that says we should have an enormous number of people who all look very different but think the same way. I want to have pluralism where we have a whole bunch of different communities, have to respect the Bill of Rights and all that kind of stuff, and no, you can't have slavery or Jim Crow. But beyond that kind of stuff, let people sort in communities, because that's how you find meaning in life, is living sociably, is living communally. And letting communities set their own standards for how to live within reasonable limits is the way to maximize happiness.
You mentioned liberal democracy a number of times. The very popular question is, isn't the teaching about respecting or loving the stranger original to Judaism and Christianity rather than liberal democracy?
Sure, I was waiting for this one. I will admit, I start the story pretty far along by starting 300 years ago. Gods used to be servants of men, or of humans. Right? You had a god of war, you had a god of sex, you had a god of fertility, you had a god of this, you had a god of that. You give them a bull, you give them an ox, you give them a goat, whatever, and they give you what you want. And then the Jews invent this thing, right? Discover, reveal, monotheism, which says, no, there aren't all these gods. There's one God, and you work for him, he doesn't work for you. And this all of a sudden creates human beings as moral actors because you start seeing them in the eyes of an all-knowing, omnipotent God. And that gives you the moral imagination, first of all, to recognize the moral worth of women, which was a huge advance. And then what Christianity does is it comes along and it takes what was essentially a tribal understanding of who God was and says it's a universal one. And I don't think that we would have liberal democratic capitalism without the Judeo-Christian values that feed into it, without the golden rule, with a lot of these other things. I'm not sure you couldn't have markets. There have been markets before in other places that weren't necessarily governed by by Judeo-Christian values. They just didn't last very long. There was something about, in the Christian faith, about understanding, going back to the fall of Rome, or going back to Jesus when he says, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's and unto God what is God's, or the Augustine model of the city of God and the city of man. This duality creates space for pluralism and a multiplication of institutions, which is essential to liberal democratic capitalism. But as George Will writes in his really magnificent new book, The Conservative Sensibility, I had to read the whole thing. It's enormous because I interviewed him on C-SPAN and my lips were really tired. The job of a conservative in America is to conserve the ideas of the American founding as amended. The conserve and preserve the vision, the liberal democratic vision that is represented by our founding, that is also represented in Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, which appealed to the best version of ourselves. It told Americans we weren't living up to who we were supposed to be. And that's what we're supposed to conserve. And so I believe, as Yuval Levin has eloquently argued, that conservatism to a certain extent is gratitude. You look around the world at the things that you find lovely and lovable and that you want to pass on to loved ones. You say, I want my kid to have this. I want my grandkids to have this. And so you defend it and you preserve it and you fight for it out of a sense of gratitude for it. And we don't teach gratitude today. We teach the opposite of gratitude, entitlement and resentment. We teach people that they're owed something almost from birth and that should be pissed off that they don't have it already. And that is the suicidal choice that's in the title of my book.
Another question. Is there a way to make liberal democratic capitalism feel right?
Feel right?
Yeah, I hate the word feelings, so that's is there a way? So I guess the question is, clearly there are people who are ill at ease living in liberal democratic societies with strong market economies. How do you make some people feel less ill at ease about it?
Yeah, and again, that's what I was kind of talking around this point. You don't. You get people to, the problems with liberal democratic capitalism that we're facing, we're putting a lot of blame on liberal democratic capitalism, which is actually coming from statism and coming from the breakdown of institutions. There are only about 5 things, this is a point that Arthur Brooks often makes, there are only about 5 things that make people happy in life. It's faith, family, friends, experiences. Genes is a big one because some of us are just born miserable bastards. And this thing called earned success. And earned success is not about the market economy. It can be, but it can also come from being a nun or a priest or a soccer coach or a good dad or a great stay-at-home mom or one of 1,000 other things. It's this thing that makes you feel that you're needed, that you've made a contribution, that you're loved, that if you disappeared tomorrow, you would be missed. Liberal democratic capitalism cannot give you that. It can create the conditions where you can find that. Right? The pursuit of happiness is an individual right. And the more institutions, the more ways of living, is the more likely it is that you will find the kind of way of living that gives you that sense of earned success, that gives you that sense of meaning and belonging. And the state can't give it to you. The state can improve your net worth. It cannot improve your self-worth. That can only be done through other institutions. Again, I keep dropping Yuval Levin's name, but he's the one who persuaded me of this. Institutions, historically, the way to understand an institution is that it's, yeah, in one sense for economists, it's a rule. But in another sense, it's a thing, a place, a group that bends individual character towards the principles or ideals of that institution. The Marines are the best example. They take these, these damn hippies in one end, and they teach them God, country, and core, and out come the other end, these incredibly impressive people. They bend people's personalities and characters to the goods of the institution, and they make them better people in the process. And there are lots of institutions, Boy Scouts, you can go down a long list, lots of institutions that fit that model. But more and more and more these days, because of this Rousseauian feeling garbage, we see institutions not as things that shape character, but as stages that we can perform upon. Stages where we can express my meanness and how awesome I am. The number of people who've become celebrities because of deliberately releasing their sex tapes. It's not incredibly widespread, but it's far higher than zero than it should be. Is a perfect example of sort of the performative aspect taking over morality. And I think so with liberal democratic capitalism, it's like water. Water finds its path. It can wear down, it can take down forests and churches, or it can go harmlessly through the riverbed out to the sea. The trick is figuring out where the rocks in the river are going to be. What are the institutions that we are going to put up that give us a sense of meaning and belonging, that gives us a sense of making a meaningful contribution? The family is the key one. There's this thing called the success sequence. It comes out of the Brookings Institution, who AEI crushes in softball, by the way. And basically, it's just this old-fashioned bourgeois norm that says if you you get the most education you can, but certainly graduate from high school. Don't have kids until you get married. Don't get married until you get as much education as you can. If you follow these basic sort of bourgeois notions of just how to live, the odds of you being poor are vanishingly small. It is a better guarantee of you're not going to get rich necessarily, but you're not going to be in poverty. If you get your values right, everything else kind of falls into place. And it's these institutions which are breaking down, they're not doing that job. That's what people think is the problem with liberal democratic capitalism. And it is true that liberal democratic capitalism poses threats to these institutions, but that's why you got to redouble the efforts to rebuild these institutions. Not all of a sudden say we're going to get rid of the thing that is the only thing that has alleviated poverty in all of human history.
We've got time for one more question, but it flows from something you just said. You mentioned that our current appeal to truth is being romantic, in that we look inward to our feelings, all this, as you say, Rousseauian stuff. What do you appeal to as the foundation of truth?
So, that's an interesting question, and it's a little daunting because I haven't been asked it before. And I hate being asked questions I haven't been asked before in front of 1,000 educated people. So I'm a little off the reservation on some of this kind of stuff. I believe in the transcendent. I believe in God. I wouldn't say that I'm a particularly religious person, but but because I'm Jewish, I feel great shame about it and guilt, if that helps. It's one of the things that lets me talk fluently with Catholics. And first of all, one of the things where I derive my understanding of truth is that I believe there is such a thing, that there is a thing called truth, and that it's findable through reason and whatnot. But also, and this is where I'm sort of off the reservation, it's hard for me to explain in pithy ways with punchlines. I'm against one-thingism. What I mean by that is, some people call it philosophical monism, right? I cannot stand I cannot stand political movements that are dedicated to a single thing. Most of life is not yes or no questions. Most of life is a checklist of questions. Very few people go onto a car dealership and say, I want a red car today. Right? You ask a lot of different questions about the kind of car you want to buy. Very few people who, when they get married, say, well, I just want to marry someone who's right-handed. Right? You tend to like have a longer list of variables and trade-offs that you bring into these equations. And so this is part of my disagreement with some of my friends on the right who have made the argument that conservatism boils down to purely a religious thing, or boils down, which is an argument that you used to hear from folks at Claremont a lot, that it boils down, or from George Will, boils down solely to the founding and the Constitution. When in reality, I think, particularly to be a conservative, is to understand it's a rich cocktail of a lot of different ingredients. And Bill Buckley used to say, borrowing a line from Whittaker Chambers, that to live is to maneuver. And what he meant by that is like you have facts that are shifting all of the time, and you have to chart your course as best you can with a spirit of open-mindedness, with a certain amount of belief that there is a truth out there to be discovered. And then the process, and this is something that is lost to a lot of people on the right these days, is try not to be a jerk about it. And so I don't have a great question about it, because I think at the end of the day, I think I draw my sense of truth from things that I believe there is a real morality out there. There's a real reality out there, that it's noticeable, that it's knowable in parts and in glimpses, but it is one of these things that it's constantly moving, and the struggle is to maneuver with it and see where it is. And it works for me, but I don't know how to, I wish I could come up with some grand unified theory about all of that, and I just don't have one.
Ladies and gentlemen, Jonah Goldberg.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.